So it's my pleasure then to introduce the third and final speaker of this first panel of this morning, Benjamin Coldron, who is here from the University of Stirling, part of a German-Scottish collaborative framework project. And just like our first speaker, he's also in a way dually qualified, but this time around, slightly unusual, but even more welcome, I think, for our field. Not computer science and law, but medical science and health and public health concerns and the law. So also, I think a very good continuation of the discussions we just had. And so I'm very pleased to pass on the virtual floor this time to him. I can't throw pieces of sugar at him, so I think I'll rely on the enforcement side on you for that one. Or I will throw small pieces of sugar at the screen and see if that works.
You can start, Ben.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Very flattering. I'm going to be talking to you today about smart regulation for the Internet of Things, and we're going to be focusing on the concept of the vulnerable consumer. So, as you said in the introduction, I'm Dr. Ben Coldron. I'm working with Guido and a lot of colleagues over in Germany. Their full names are down there, on an international project which is called Smart Tech to Smart Laws. And we're basically looking to map emerging consumer issues in the Internet of Things. We're looking to critically assess the extent to which consumer laws in Germany and the UK cover those issues. We're going to be trying to scope out the potential for mutual learning between the two legal systems, and we're going to try and develop recommendations for changes to the current regulations and law. So we're working with colleagues from Warwick and the University of.
If that's okay, I think Ben, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Sorry.
Yeah, I think because the connection's not working very well, maybe you can turn off your camera, and that might help a little bit.
Sure. Let me just stop the share. Okay, I'll move closer to the router as well.
Yeah. It's in Inverness. Nice to have someone.
Right, I'm gonna share the screen again.
Yeah.
Does the connection seem a bit better now?
Yeah. Thanks.
Brilliant. So let's just get to the joys of technology, eh? So yeah, we're it's an international project. We're working with Warwick, University of Bonn, and University of Osnabrück. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, but yeah. So the aims of this presentation, we're going to be looking to map out various definitions of vulnerability in sort of the theoretical discourse. We're going to look at how that concept is applied to vulnerable consumers in EU law, and we're going to try and discuss the legal concept suitability and application to the Internet of Things. So in terms of methods, I'm using sort of philosophical methods. Firstly, conceptual, looking at the sort of fundamental constituents of the concept of vulnerability, and then a sort of pragmatic analysis, looking at the consequences of adopting a given definition in the sort of Internet of Things space. So I'm sure you're probably already aware and might have covered this in day one and things, but the Internet of Things refers to devices that form a network of physical objects that are implanted with sensors, software, and other technologies for the purposes of connecting and exchanging data with other devices and companies and services over the internet. So things also have actuating potential, so they can use that data to actually act on the world. So as consumers, we judge the value of smart things primarily by their usefulness. The methods and processes are often a bit of a black box. So we don't necessarily see how particular results are achieved or on what basis decisions and actions are made upon. So this presents a bit of a problem for consumers potentially. Internet of Things businesses and devices can use data to benefit consumers, so to personalize and improve services, but they can also use their power and of the data to target and influence consumers' vulnerabilities for economic and financial gain. So behavioral economics suggests that in general, consumers do not necessarily act in a sort of rational, self-interested manner. There are various biases within people's behavior that renders a great many of us, if not all of us, potentially vulnerable to manipulation within the online space and within economic transactions through the Internet of Things. So consumers have limited ability to take in information. So I'm thinking about sort of terms and conditions and things like that. And they are also influenced by how things are presented and when they are presented to them. So this can potentially create a bit of a market-specific form of vulnerability. Many of us might be rendered vulnerable by the context of the economic and architecture of the Internet of Things. So when we choose between complex alternatives or make decisions with poor information, we're obviously more vulnerable to being exploited. And this can put consumers at a particular disadvantage when engaging in economic activity through the Internet of Things. So the lack of screens, imperfect knowledge of the technology, the huge proliferation of actors and intermediaries providing the products and services within the Internet of Things means that identifying, protecting and enforcing your interests as a consumer is more difficult. So Internet of Things devices can also actually create, target and exploit vulnerabilities by design. So all this means that the Internet of Things is a technological frontier that demands much more context-specific consumer protections. So moving on to a bit more of a theoretical discussion about the concept of vulnerability itself. The Oxford English Dictionary defines the term vulnerable, its most basic, as a susceptibility to harm, and vulnerable people as those in need of special protection because of age, disability, risk, abuse or neglect. So this is quite a narrow definition. And traditionally, that sort of definition has been closely associated with the related concept of risk, which has sort of been bracketed off as part of the external environment. So vulnerability is a sort of inherent characteristic of the individual, whereas risk is an aspect of the external environment. So generally, we can sort of identify three broad categories of definition of vulnerability. So the first is that inherent or pathogenic vulnerability, which is very similar to the Oxford English Dictionary definition, whereby the vulnerability is an individual characteristic. The second is a universal or ontological vulnerability that generally comes from sort of political theorists, feminist theory, whereby vulnerability is an inherent aspect of the human condition. And the third is a bit of a middle ground, which is a contextual or relational vulnerability, whereby people are rendered vulnerable in particular situations and by particular power imbalances with different agents. So looking at inherent vulnerability in a bit more detail, in medicalized discourses, vulnerability is often seen as an inherent characteristic that increases people's susceptibility to harm as a result of things like age, physical or mental disabilities or disease. So vulnerability is sort of a combination of inherent frailties or impairments and external risk that come together to create vulnerability in practice. Now, universal vulnerability within these sorts of approaches is viewed as an ontological condition of all human existence. So theorists like Feynman argue that legal and political theory is often traditionally founded on this myth of the autonomous and rational subject. So in sort of neoliberal conceptions of the world, the individual consumer acts in a rational and self-interested way. And the idea of universal vulnerability is sort of intended as a way to disrupt those sort of base assumptions and to make an argument that those assumptions should be challenged. So another theorist in this sort of tradition is Judith Butler. There's a quote there: the body is constituently social and independent, and it is this embodied vulnerability to others that makes human life precarious. So the middle ground is sort of relational vulnerability. So within this theory, vulnerable persons are those with reduced capacity, power, or control to protect their interests relative to other agents. So the idea is that we all have sort of dispositional vulnerabilities, potential vulnerabilities, that only then become relevant when we interact with agents with the power to target and exploit those vulnerabilities and convert them into what theorists like Halberger call occurrent vulnerabilities. So with the power of Internet of Things devices and other technologies to collect our data in real time and curate and create digital environments that are designed to exploit vulnerabilities, I think relational vulnerability is particularly relevant and useful in assessing and critiquing law and regulation in the Internet of Things, because it's not necessarily the inherent vulnerability of the consumer that law and regulation might want to concentrate on, but in fact the excessive power of companies to generate increased susceptibility to harm and to exploit that. So theorists advocating relational approaches view the sort of moral obligations to protect consumers as arising out of vulnerability, and that actually extends to protection from harm to the provision of social support to promote autonomy. So it actually allows us to go back into the actual fundamental design of the digital architecture to try and argue for positive legal duties deriving from these positive moral duties. And that follows on from the sort of Kantian principle of respect for persons. So using relational vulnerability, we can build an argument that the law must be responsive to human vulnerability, in particular to the way that our capacities for rational agency are rendered vulnerable by the architecture of the Internet of Things environment. So it provides a critical perspective from which regulatory responses to vulnerability in the Internet of Things can be identified and critiqued. So we've got this broad spectrum of vulnerability, from narrow definitions of inherent vulnerability, where it's an inherent characteristic, to much broader definitions of sort of universal vulnerability. So moving on to try and apply some of those concepts to consumer law and policy. Vulnerability in law and policy discourse is often used to identify individuals or groups that require specific regulatory or policy attention. And often they use the narrow definition. So they look at inherent characteristics such as disability and age and things like that. So in EU consumer law, the benchmark is the average consumer, which corresponds to the sort of autonomous self-interested agents that we looked at before. And vulnerable groups must basically plead special treatment by demonstrating their divergence from that average consumer. So unfair practices under the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive are then assessed from the perspective of the average member of the vulnerable social group once the argument of vulnerability is made. So the UCP directive has three elements defining vulnerability. You need to show that you're part of a clearly identified group of consumers, that you're particularly vulnerable to the particular practice or the underlying product because of mental or physical infirmity, age, or credulity. And in a way in which the trader could reasonably be expected to foresee. Now, there's debate as to whether this list of groups identified is exhaustive or not, but credulity potentially provides a way to try and expand that definition. So mental or physical infirmity or impairments include things like learning disabilities, mental illness, as well as blindness, deafness, and paralysis. Age, we're often concentrating on the very young or the elderly. But credulity is a bit of a broader concept. So it's assumed if a consumer is not able to correctly, rationally assess the characteristics of a product, and for this reason is inclined to believe certain claims of the advertiser more easily than the average consumer. There is a problem in terms of arguing that in the ECJ, because you have to, it's a rather vague category, and to qualify for the additional protection, you must argue that you're part of a clearly identifiable group. So if we're arguing that consumers as a whole engaging with the Internet of Things are particularly credulous, then they're not necessarily a clearly identifiable group. So it's been interpreted relatively narrowly within the case law, but it does have the potential to be broadened out in scope. Now, the European Commission has shown signs of expanding the definition of consumer vulnerability from that sort of inherent definition to a more outcome-based definition, a more contextual definition in recent years. So all the way back to 2016, they mooted a definition which was based on a consumer who, as a result of socio-demographic, behavioural or personal situation or their market environment, is then at higher risk of experiencing negative outcomes within the market, has limited ability to maximise their well-being, difficulty obtaining or assimilating information, or more susceptible to certain marketing practices. So focusing on the outcome rather than the cause of vulnerability would create a lower threshold for identifying unfair practices, and would provide a more accurate protection for consumers in the Internet of Things. So in terms of sort of positive legal duties, consumer law doesn't necessarily impose any fiduciary or protective responsibilities on companies within the Internet of Things. Now, in human rights and data protection law, qualification as a vulnerable group can trigger more positive legal obligations, and that's based on sort of moral responsibilities triggered by vulnerability. But consumer vulnerability, as I said, in EU law at present, is only relevant in assessing the fairness of terms or whether a practice qualifies as either misleading or aggressive. So there's room for improvement within the kind of consumer law acquiesce. They use within that consumer law acquiesce, they use a very narrow definition of vulnerability, whereby groups of consumers or characteristics are identified as creating a greater risk of harm. And that obviously fails to underline that in some situations, all consumers need more positive protection to ensure that their autonomy and ability to protect their interests is preserved. So, as I said, there is evidence that the EU Commission is moving towards a more contextualized approach, but we're not there yet. So in summary, we can identify a spectrum of vulnerability definitions, from narrow inherent vulnerability approaches to very broad universal vulnerability. And there's a middle ground of that sort of relational and contextualized vulnerability. The Unfair Commercial Practices Directive uses a particularly static approach where particular groups of consumers or characteristics are identified, and positive duties are not triggered by vulnerability in Internet of Things environments, where customers' vulnerabilities may continue to be created, identified, and or exploited. So this sort of taxonomy of vulnerability can help us articulate and describe the nature of the problem and the moral obligations Internet of Things companies and lawmakers and regulators have towards consumers, which could be established as positive legal duties to protect and support autonomy and empowerment before dispositional vulnerability is converted into a current vulnerability. So that it's a potentially useful sort of machine of thought or a tool for assessing and critiquing current law, and even potentially building arguments for specific regulatory change in response to specific types of vulnerability. So for inherently vulnerable groups like the disabled, people with disabilities, the young and old, we might have a particular legal regime. For places where markets create and exploit vulnerabilities by design, we might have a more universal vulnerability sort of approach. And in other places, we might want to have a more contextualized response within the law, policy, and practice. So I've just sort of laid out the potential steps of that argument. The exploitation and creation of vulnerabilities is part of the Internet of Things, and that's sort of deeply embedded in that environment by design. That creates relational or universal vulnerabilities, which means we as lawmakers and regulators might have a moral obligation to better protect consumers where those power imbalances are particularly acute. And that points to deficiencies in the current regulation of the Internet of Things and current definitions of vulnerability, which are restricted to inherent characteristics. And that can lead to recommendations to redress those power imbalances at the outset, and in terms of protecting consumers in the case law. So yeah, in conclusion, the architecture of the Internet of Things environment can combine data collection with manipulating consumers to exploit and even create vulnerabilities. Current definitions of vulnerability in EU consumer law are inadequate. They don't acknowledge or deal with relational or universal vulnerabilities, nor do they provide positive duties to protect consumers. And therefore, a rethink of the concepts of average and vulnerable consumers is needed to adapt law and policy to this new technological frontier. So moving towards a more relational and contextualized definition is potentially a good start in ECG case law to assess vulnerability, and may also provide an argument for establishing positive duties on Internet of Things companies to support consumer autonomy. Thank you very much for listening, and yeah, I'm happy to take any questions now.